Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is lawyer with a moral core. The year is 1848, and Lincoln is finishing up his one and only term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He had taken a one-term pledge, getting ready to head back to Illinois, but in the meantime, he's also getting caught up in the presidential contest, and he was all for Zachary Taylor, the Whig nominee. Now, Taylor had no political background. He had been a soldier for 40 years, but he had done well in the recent Mexican War. He's up now as the Whig candidate for president. And Lincoln was all in. Lincoln said, our only chances with Taylor. I go for him, not because I think he would make a better president than Clay, but because I think he would make a better one than Polk or Cass or Buchanan, those last three being from the other party, the Democrats. So Lincoln was ready to go all in with Taylor. He also was all in with a colleague in the House, Congressman Alexander Stephens of Georgia. Lincoln and Stephens set up the first Congressional Taylor Club. They called themselves the Young Indians. Some of the irony here, of course, is that about a decade later, Stephens would very much be on the opposite side of things as the vice president of the Confederate States of America while Lincoln was president. For now, though, Lincoln is all for Taylor as president. He's stumped and is not only in his home state of Illinois, but also in Massachusetts and Maryland. He attacked Lewis Cass, who was the eventual nominee of the Democrats, for his varying positions on slavery. Lincoln even had a chance to represent the party as a delegate to the Whig National Convention that year in Philadelphia. Well, Taylor beat Cass in the fall election, close election, but this meant the Whigs would be in power in the executive branch for only the second time ever, and that meant jobs, patronage, maybe an opportunity for Lincoln to be rewarded. Well, Lincoln had set his eyes on the commissioner of the General Land Office. If he could get a job, that's the one that he wanted. But then he found out that some of his friends were also kind of interested in this position, so he decided not to push it, did not get the position, and later on he expressed he was very disappointed about this. He said that I hardly ever felt so bad at any failure in my life in not getting that post. Well, the Taylor administration did come along with an offer. It was to become the governor of the territory of Oregon, but Lincoln turned it down. This was a Democratic stronghold. It was far from his home base in Illinois. He just didn't think there were any advantages for him taking that position, so he decided to decline and focus on the law. Speaking of the law, before he left back to head home for Illinois, after going to Taylor's inauguration, he had his one and only chance to try a case in the Supreme Court. The case was Lewis for use of Longworth v. Lewis. It was a statute of limitations case based on something that had occurred back in his home state of Illinois. Lincoln, in this case, did not prevail. It was also at this time that Lincoln got a patent, the only president to ever have a patent. Turned out the year before, Lincoln had been on a boat that got stuck on a sandbar. He said, well, this has got a problem that needs to be solved. So he invented a solution that would raise boats without having to remove all the cargo to lighten the load. Kind of a creative thing to do, but it never really caught on the market, but he did get his patent. His real focus was his law partnership with his junior partner, Billy Herndon, is now his close friend, and they were going full bore, leading many cases across the state of Illinois. They had individual clients that were criminal cases, civil cases. They also had an increasingly number of large corporate clients, so starting to actually make some money for the first time in Lincoln's life. Lincoln, very effective in the courtroom, but he was plain spoken. He was, common sense. He would use his humor and storytelling techniques to really connect with juries. He would connect with all people, so very effective. He had kind of a shrill voice, so that wasn't terribly appealing, but almost everything else made Lincoln very sort of popular and easy to follow in the courtroom. Lincoln worked really hard. He prepared really well for every case. His goal was to know that case backward and forward from both sides, his side and his opposition side, and that would make him the most effective. But part of Lincoln's journey as a lawyer was this sense of morality, that moral core. He encouraged people to settle. Don't go with frivolous lawsuits. And he would turn some down like he did with this gentleman, who he said, you must remember that some things that are legally right are not morally right. I shall not take your case, but will give you a little advice for which I will charge you nothing. You seem to be a sprightly, energetic man. I would advise you to try your hand at making $600 some other way, not by this lawsuit, and Lincoln walked away from it. Another example where Lincoln was approached by a rather wealthy man who wanted Lincoln to file suit over a debt, $2.50. Well, Lincoln said, look, don't do this. This is a waste of time. Why would you file a lawsuit over this? It's going to cost you more to get your $250 back. The man was unmoved. He wanted to file suit, and if Lincoln wouldn't do it, he would find someone else who did. Well, Lincoln said, fine, I'm going to charge you $10. Is that what you want? He said, fine. He'll pay $10 to get $250. Apparently, it was the principle of the thing. Well, Lincoln had his own principles, and he had a different idea on how to get an outcome. He decided that he would go down to the courthouse and file the suit. He then found the debtor and said, look, I'm going to give you half my money. I'm going to give you $5. Let's go to the courthouse together. You take half of that, pay off your debt. You keep the rest. I'll keep $5, and we'll go our separate ways. And that's what they did. This was part of the sort of the moral approach that Lincoln found in trying to do the right thing. Money was one thing that never motivated Abraham Lincoln. One of his friends, G.W. Harris, said that the same indifference extended to money. So long as his wants were supplied, and they were few and simple, he seemed to have no further use for money except in the giving or the lending of it, with no expectation or desires for its return to those whom he thought needed it more than he. Just was never a big deal for Lincoln. Now, there are many legal cases that we could talk about in terms of Lincoln's law career. We'll just highlight a couple of more. One was very personal to him. It was the case of William Duff Armstrong. Now, Armstrong was the son of Jack and Hannah Armstrong. Jack Armstrong had befriended Lincoln from their early days in their youth when they had a wrestling match, and Lincoln won that, and they became close, and they stayed close. In fact, when Lincoln would have some hard times, he'd be in between jobs, it would often be Jack and Hannah Armstrong that would welcome Lincoln into their home, give him a bed, a room to stay in while waiting to get back on his feet. Well, William Armstrong had been charged with murder, and it looked like kind of an open and shut case against him. Had a couple of lawyers, but Hannah Armstrong asked Lincoln if she would step in and take a hand in this, and Lincoln immediately said he would, and he basically saved William Armstrong's life. There was the prime witness in the case swore that he saw Armstrong club this man over the head, and the man was killed on the spot. It was at night when he saw this. He was about 150 feet away, but he said there was a full moon. He could see everything like the light of day. Well, Lincoln listened to all of this very carefully, and then he did some research. He pulled out an almanac, and he found out at that hour there was no moon at all. It was pure darkness. Well, he made this case the next day to the jury. He followed up with a very powerful summary, accentuating his personal relationship with the Armstrongs. He was in tears, the jury was in tears, everyone was in tears, and the verdict came back not guilty. Well, the Armstrongs were overjoyed. Hannah was thrilled, hugging Lincoln, but saying, look, I'm too poor to pay. And Lincoln said, why, Hannah, I shan't charge you a cent. Never. Anything I can do for you, I will do willingly and without charges. This was typical for a Lincoln to do. Part of his reputation would follow, and he would grow followers because of sort of this moral and aspect of his approach. And again, he just didn't really care that much about the money. Now, he did make a buck. And there were times, especially in these corporate cases, where he was happy to get paid. In fact, he pushed for it in this particular case with the Illinois Central Railroad, who actually became one of his biggest clients. The year is 1852, and the Illinois Central Railroad wasn't even up and running yet, and they had gotten permission from the state as an incentive to build their railroad, and they would not be taxed by anybody until the railroad was actually up and running. That was the incentive, so they would invest the capital to build the rail line. Well, the counties in Illinois said that they didn't sign up for this deal that the state had given, and at the county level, they started charging taxes to the Illinois Central Railroad. Well, the railroad cried foul, and they decided to sue, and they hired Abraham Lincoln to represent them. Well, Lincoln did a great job, had a resounding victory, saved the railroad some $500,000 in the process, and so he decided to charge them $2,000 for his services, which of course was a lot of money in those days, and certainly a lot to Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, that bill was rejected. The railroad said it was excessive. Well, Lincoln's friend said, that's nonsense. You just saved them $500,000. In fact, you're worth more than $2,000 in terms of what you did for them. And so Lincoln agreed, and he sent them a bill for $5,000. Not surprisingly, the railroad said, we're declining to pay this one as well. So what did Lincoln do? He sued the railroad, and he won a judgment for the full $5,000. There was no hurt feelings over this. In fact, the Illinois Central Railroad continued to hire Lincoln 50 more times throughout the rest of the 1850s. This was the one case where, more on principle, Lincoln did go after the money. Well, in the meantime, while all of this is going on, it is not lost on Abraham Lincoln that his country is in turmoil right now over the topic of slavery expansion, the potential for that into all this land that the United States had just acquired from Mexico in the recent war. There was a sectional divide that was crossing party lines, north versus south. Now, Lincoln been consistent in his view on slavery. It is permissible, and the government has no right to do anything about it in the states where it already existed. But he was becoming increasingly clear that he was adamantly against any expansion of slavery beyond those states where it already existed. Well, these very debates were happening in Congress at the time, and there was actually a move to potentially have another grand compromise, kind of like the Missouri Compromise from 30 years before. But President Taylor wasn't in favor of the compromise. He thought it was taking on too many issues and was just going to cause problems. But Taylor died about a year and a half into his term in July of 1850. And along comes Millard Fillmore, the vice president, is now the president, and he supports the compromise that Henry Clay and others were working through Congress. Those compromise measures hit the desk of Millard Fillmore, and he signed them, with California coming in as a free state, New Mexico and Utah coming in as territories with no specificity on slavery. The slave trade in Washington, D.C. was canceled, although slavery was still permitted in D.C. A boundary dispute between Texas and New Mexico was settled, and a more stringent fugitive slave law was passed. These were all part of the big compromise measures of 1850. It seemed like for a moment maybe things would settle down, but hardly. This tension in the country over slavery and its expansion was really just heating up. Lincoln would be very much involved in that fight going forward, but those are stories for another day. That is Abraham Lincoln, and lawyer with a moral core, from the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.